from the Pathfinder Foundation to Ms. Indrani Bagchi, CEO of the Ananta Aspen Centre and its staff, as well as the guest speakers, discussants from both institutions, and others joining the roundtable virtually. Today we are going to discuss an important subject. It is on the subject of enhancing connectivity between India and Sri Lanka. So the critical word here is connectivity. The Pathfinder Foundation has working relationship with many think tanks in India. However, this is the first time we are having an engagement with Ananta. And we hope that this interaction would lead us to have more regular interactions in the future. As I said earlier, the focus of the webinar is how to enhance connectivity between our two countries. We have two major themes here. One is digital and the other one is physical connectivity. We all know both subjects are important. However, looking from the Sri Lankan side, we see considerable, or we attach considerable importance to physical connectivity. Now, why are we talking about physical connectivity? We all know the location of Sri Lanka. Its strategic location is very well recognized, and I don't have to go into that. We have robust maritime relations with India, and as well as air connectivity. Speaking of maritime, Colombo Port functions as the hub port for South Asia region, and air connectivity is quite impressive with considerable room for future expansion. However, the ferry connection is lagging behind, sad to say. Both governments are struggling to revive the century-old ferry connection. But we have no idea as to when that connection can be made to have the ferry connection, which started in something like 1914 during the last century. Now, when we have this the connectivity, we expect considerable economic transformation so far as Sri Lanka is concerned. A proposed models of physical connectivity will transform northern province, north central province, and to a certain extent the eastern province, taking into consideration the development projects that will take place in those areas. If the proposed road is complemented by rail, it will facilitate increased business for the ports of Colombo, port of Hambantota, as well as the port of Trincomalee, which is recognized as one of the largest natural harbors in the world. Then beneficiary of these activities will be tourism. We have considerable tourism both ways, from Sri Lanka to India as well as India to Sri Lanka, and we expect the tourist traffic will increase, and that will also help people-to-people relations between the two countries. Now, this is the positive side of the enterprise what we are talking about. That we have also to recognize that there are a lot of challenges starting from or due to the asymmetric relationship between Sri Lanka and India, taking into consideration the size of the population, the geographical size, economy, which all differ vastly between the two countries. Then Sri Lankan side, we will have to battle another big problem. That is the island mentality of Sri Lankans. We have been separated from India for over 2 millennia. and thinking of having land connectivity, despite the fact that we have maritime connectivity, we have air connectivity. When it comes to land connectivity, it touches the very sensitive nerve of Sri Lanka. This is not abnormal. If you go back to the 1970s, you will remember how United Kingdom or England was fighting against the building of the Channel Tunnel. And a lot of people used to say, over our dead bodies, we will never allow ourselves to be connected to Europe. So that is what I say, island mentality. We will have to overcome that to address that particular situation. Then, in addition to that, we have a lot of historical as well as contemporary baggage. I don't want to go into detail. We all know what these are. Sri Lankans have that disadvantage as well. Then we also have the fear of being overwhelmed by India. Take, for example, the free trade agreement. I think the first in South Asia that was signed in 1998. And then, since then, we have hit a brick wall. We have not been able to progress despite much work, effort taken by both sides. We hope that obstacle will be removed in the near future. But this fear of being overwhelmed is very much there. And then there is also another factor, that is influence of domestic politics, that is so far as India is concerned. We feel, there is a feeling here in Sri Lanka, that bilateral relations will be subordinate to the state level politics. Here I am referring to our experience, Sri Lanka's experience with Tamil Nadu, Sri Lanka relations, particularly hinged on the fisheries dispute. I should not use the word dispute, fisheries issue between the two countries, which should have been solved in 1970s, so was solved from our point of view in 1970s, but it still continues. Then there is another factor, that is lack of or no progress on numerous agreements and MOUs signed between the two countries. We should not attach responsibility of that particular lacuna to India. Both countries are really responsible for it. But looking from the Sri Lankan point, there are complaints we have heard that India signs agreements, but progress is slow, or there is hardly any progress. So these are the mindset of the Sri Lankans, which we will have to overcome. Then, of course, lately we also come across of another issue, somewhat of a resentment towards India, due to the fact that there are references coming from India that India expects India should be the first stop for anything what Sri Lanka needs. Don't go anywhere else. First come to India, and if you fail, you can go out. And there is a school of thought who thinks that Sri Lanka should have the freedom to go wherever it wants to go, in seek of whatever needs they have. Not only it should not be limited to, or the first stop should not be India. So these are the issues what we have. But then from the Sri Lankan point of view, we need to realize several things. First thing is, the world is transforming exponentially. Sri Lanka can live in idyllic kind of isolation. Meanwhile, everything around us will change. This we will have to understand and remedy. Then, to address these situations, Sri Lankan should learn to think out of box, not live in the past. If I may dare to say, not even the present, but think about 50 years ahead. then we have to recognize that India's economy is galloping fast. Sri Lanka could make progress by integrating our economy to India's. Then the word integrating also touches a raw nerve here in Sri Lanka, but for lack of any other language, I use the word integrating. If we don't do that, Sri Lanka will remain a bystander with $12 billion export economy as we have now. So we should try to avoid that kind of situation. There will be a plethora of dissenting views with regard to the road connectivity, rail connectivity, grid, multi-product pipeline, revival of Trincomalee tank complex, so and so forth. Such reactions are inevitable, but we should not be discussed. Finally, we need to engage in a public awareness program, facilitating discussion and debate. More programs like that, what we are having today, will help the disseminating process. I think we should think of that as one of the solutions to address various kind of challenges we may face as we go along on this endeavor that is connecting physical connectivity between Sri Lanka and India. With that, I will stop. I have already exceeded the time given to me. I would like to invite Ms. Indrani Bagchi, CEO of Ananta Aspen Centre, to take the floor now.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Bernard, and thank you to everybody from the Pathfinder team. Special thanks to Ambassador Milinda Moragoda, with whom I had a first conversation on a dialogue that we could do about over a year ago. And I'm really pleased that we can be doing this today. We've started modestly by doing an online webinar, and I'm hoping that sooner rather than later we can take this to the physical domain, and we can have conversations in each other's countries. As for the topics today, I think these have been very carefully chosen. Connectivity is something that is very important, as is a big part of Indian foreign policy, both in the neighborhood and outside. Certainly in the neighborhood, the element of physical connectivity comes in as apart from digital connectivity. We are looking at a transformation of both the Indian foreign policy, but also of the world. And certainly the last few years has taught us the power of digital public infrastructure, both as a tool for development, as a tool for technological leapfrogging, and as a tool for foreign policy. And I think that's something that we can reasonably hope to connect Sri Lanka with. As Ambassador Bernard just said, the word integration is sensitive to Sri Lanka. Maybe to sort of as a nod to the world today, we can say that Sri Lanka can log in to the Indian economy or to Indian technological prowess and make that part of her own developmental progress. We do have history, as we do with pretty much every neighbor in this area, and we will continue to have history. We will continue to have the smaller countries like Sri Lanka being more sensitive to their space as opposed to this large giant that we must appear to everybody. And for India, I would say that we also need to be a lot more sensitive to be aware of where Sri Lanka is coming from for a lot of these areas. I'm really glad we will be touching on both areas of connectivity, physical and digital. And with that, let me start the first session on digital public infrastructure, and may I turn it over to our moderator, Promit Palchaudhary. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we will be talking about digital public infrastructure. One of the things that in the run-up to the G20 summit that India hosted last year, India consulted about 120 countries around the world, and I believe Sri Lanka was one of them. And one of the things we noticed, or one of the things Indian diplomats and officials realized, was a lot of these countries, especially in what is now renamed the Global South, the combination of both developing or overall developing countries and now so-called emerging economies, basically said that, look, we recognize there's a new revolution in the world economy, whether it's green technology, the digital revolution, and we don't want to be left behind. We don't want to. We're already behind in some ways. We don't want to be caught out on this next series of new technologies. But we're also conscious that given what I call great power rivalry, particularly between the United States and China, we also don't want to get caught up in that either. And in the case of digital public infrastructure, this was particularly acute because what type of technologies you use, the standards you adopted, were you going to use Huawei or were you going to use Ericsson for your routers? Were you going to use, which chips were you going to use for your data centers and so on? All had a geopolitical element to it. And so one of the things they did ask many of these governments is, does India have a third solution? Do you have something that can help us on this? And India, one thing India, I think, can claim to have accomplished in the past 10 years has been a remarkable rollout of digital services, accomplishments in fintech, biometric identification, and the creation of really one of the world's most advanced digital infrastructures at very low cost. And India was prepared to provide, to support the idea of spreading this without it necessarily having to be tied to India in any specific way. And we have 4 panelists to talk about both the Indian and the Sri Lankan perspectives on this. And I will introduce each of them as they begin to speak. I will start, however, with Rudra Chaudhary, Director of Carnegie India. Over to you, Rudra.
Thanks, Pramit, to the Pathfinder Foundation, and Ananta, thank you so much for inviting me. I have 7 minutes. I'll make 4 points and then kind of expand in Q&A. So as Pramit said, just a little bit of context is DPI is not new. The G20 didn't create DPI. The story goes back to the early part of the century. If you look at Europe, Estonia had legislation on DPI as early as 2002, 2003, in fact, in the 1990s as well. Singapore built out SingPass in 2003, 2004, and India kind of came online around 2009. The thinking, of course, started a bit earlier. And this was with our journey on ID, on Aadhaar, which then migrated to payments in 2014. An international payments kind of organization was created in 2016. And now we've evolved this landscape to look at data exchanges. And you really have the best person to talk about data exchanges after me, Rahul. But that's the general kind of context. But as Pramit said, I think what the G20 really did was electrified what DPI could do, both for development, but also for commerce in different parts of the world. India, of course, spoke to over 100 countries on DPI, but it was really the 20 jurisdictions of the G20 where it was a tough fight. I mean, I remember back in February of 2023, when the journey began in the first Digital Economy Working Group meeting, a number of, call it Global North countries, didn't even speak up. They refused to even speak up on DPI because A, they did not know what it was. And that was in some sense, that was our bad. We are not actually communicated clearly what DPI actually is. Is DPI ORAN? Is DPI Huawei? Is it full stack? These are the kind of questions that started coming through to think tanks like ours. There were 4 meetings of the DWG. By the 3rd meeting, it was clear there was a lot more communication. And in the end, you had 2 consensus documents through the G20. One was the Digital Economy Working Group, where essentially you had 20 countries and observer nations that agreed to consensus on what would be good DPI. Because DPI can't be everything. So they provided some principal markers in terms of saying, look, this is essentially, if you were to build DPI, this is what good DPI would look like. The second was a document produced by the task force under the finance ministry, and Rahul was part of that kind of task force. I think he still is, which created another consensus document, which was in fact a lot more elaborate. So you had an agreement in general. So what the G20 did was, apart from the agreement itself, people in America, USAID, FCDO, GIZ in Germany, woke up and said, okay, there's this thing called DPI and it's transformational. What does it do? It essentially leapfrogs development, right? So the Indian case is pretty clear. What we've managed to do in about 10 or 14 years, you ordinarily would take about 30 to 40 years to accomplish in terms of bringing people online, in terms of banking, formal economy, and so on and so forth. And the statistics are pretty clear here. So then the question is, then what is DPI? At the base, and I think this is really important, hundreds of countries are at this particular point in time beginning or well on their way in their digital transformation journeys. Now, essentially, digital transformation can be done in two ways. The traditional way of doing it, or the older way of doing it, is you have a problem, your ministry has a problem. It could be transport, it could be agriculture, could be something to do with climate, for instance. And you say, listen, I need a solution. In order to get a solution, you put out a tender. There'll be some kind of a company. The company could be in France, it could be in Ethiopia, could be in India, that basically bids for the tender. And you build what is called a proprietary stack solution. So it's a single stack solution for a single problem, right? Now, 3 years later, the country says, hey, listen, I want my transport solution to connect with my agricultural solution, right? That ministry then puts out yet another tender. You have yet another bid, another contractor comes in, another vendor comes in, and you have another tube well that's built. And what we've seen essentially in the last kind of many decades is countries essentially are building tube wells, right? These tube wells are serviced by various vendors. Making changes within the tube well itself proves to be very expensive. Nepal knows this. They've tried an RFP and an adjustment to the RFP. It's cost a lot of money. Indonesia knows this, which is why now they're considering what we call the DPI way. Essentially, what DPI does is saying is that, listen, you don't need the tube wells, right? This doesn't mean that you don't need the private sector. You need the private sector, but you don't need the tube wells. So shift your mind to say you have the same problem, you want a solution, but essentially create shared, interoperable, and reusable technologies. So reusable source codes, reusable protocols, which is owned by the sovereign or placed in an institutional framework that is regulated by the sovereign, right? So tomorrow, for instance, and the most important over here is, why do you go for shared? So that you're not vendor locked in. So the vendor, some company sitting in France or the US or India or wherever, can't actually dictate terms in terms of what can or cannot be done by Sri Lanka or the Maldives or Bangladesh or wherever, right? But yet private sector is very important. So the sovereign has the infrastructure in a sense, the private sector plays on top of it. India's payments interface is one of the best examples. The protocols are actually housed under a regulatory authority called the NPCI. Two of the largest market players on top are actually American companies, which own about 80 to 85% of the market share of our payments transactions, which stands at about 13 billion per month. So DPI in a sense, so one is, what is DPI? And we can unpack this. I'm mindful of the time, but please think of it as reusable, interoperable, shareable, that avoids vendor lock-in. That's very important and gives power back to the sovereign, right? But essentially, if you want DPI to succeed, it's all about innovation. So you need the markets, you need private sector to play with technology, and then of course to play with governance, a piece that Rahul knows better than most. I'll just spend the last 2 minutes in terms of what are we seeing across the world today when it comes to DPI. So there are a number of countries knocking on the doors of those who know a little bit about DPI. We're seeing 3 groups of people really electrified. One is countries where the demand is coming from. So these could be big ocean states. There are a lot of countries under the population of, say, 2 to 3 million that want some kind of digital transformation. It could be to hand electronically monies out to its citizens, subsidies. It could be for a variety of reasons. For these countries, essentially, and this is important, it's not necessary to start with ID. That was India's journey. We started with ID, we went to payments, then we went to data exchange. You don't need to follow that sequence in itself, right? If you want, so the essence is, you tell us what the problem is, And then there are solutions and what you call open source asset holders in India that will help you with the diagnosis in themselves. What we're seeing is a huge demand, but what we're also seeing is there is a need for speed, right? So there are two essential ways within DPI if you want to build out. One is what you would call the traditional procurement route. So that's a country says, hey, listen, I want everything customized down to the last T on my land. I want my data centers. I want my network switches. I want to control the data. I want to build out this infrastructure from bottom up. I don't have what it takes within the country, so I procure from outside. My understanding, and for good reason, many countries want this for sovereign reasons. Sri Lanka has gone down the procurement route when it comes to ID. But our experience with procurement is that it's full of frictions. Ordinarily, it will take about 2 to 3 years. There are problems with RFPs, with tenders, with terms of reference. I would just encourage our friends in Sri Lanka, apart from ID is a journey that you've already begun. Think of an alternative. Today, technology has innovated. Many countries are beginning to consider what's called a cloud-based solution for DPI, which is perhaps more subscribable. It's less customizable, but it's more rapidly deployable. So when you're looking at credentials, for instance, you want formal credentialing of your documents in Sri Lanka, I would say look at alternative sources. Some of these are being tested in places like Trinidad and Tobago, in Malawi. And our sense is that's what's going to scale to about 40, 50 different countries over the next 5 years. So sorry, that's a lot to pack in, but let me stop there.
Thanks, Rudra. I'll now turn to Mahesh Pereira, CEO of the Information and Communication Technology Agency of the Sri Lankan government.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here. And I would like to touch upon the importance of DPI and its adaptability in Sri Lankan context. So I would touch upon the previous presenter talk about more about DPI. And I also would like to share with you a few perspectives about our understanding about DPI and why DPI is so crucial in Sri Lanka at this stage. And so how we could adopt DPI in Sri Lanka. So those are the 3 key points that I would like to touch upon during this 5 to 6 minutes. And first of all, I must thank the Government of India and the Center for DPI and those who passionately work on this DPI approach. And I mean, they are the one who documented and promote this approach. I strongly believe DPI is the only way to do national digital transformation. So for me, DPI is quite foundational. DPI is, I believe, is the magic behind the Indian digital revolution. And I believe it's the only way to make this national digital transformation, as I mentioned earlier. So for me, I strongly believe, so DPI is a way of thinking and way of execution. So this is something we all need to understand why I say it's way of thinking. Now, as my colleague mentioned earlier, the traditional transformation approach. Need is identified, a specification is done by a contractor or a consultant, and a vendor is hired to develop the system, and you end up with a system which is hardly interactable, which is hardly serve the purpose. And you have a platform which is quite incapable. And that is why we call over 80 to 90% digital transformation initiatives are failed. So now what's the, in contrast, so what's the DPI approach? So DPI sees this entire thing as a collection of smaller building blocks. So there are certain foundational building blocks which are common in any digital transformation domain. Like I'm quite skeptical whether we could do without IDs. IDs and registries are certain foundational building blocks, or signatures, e-signatures. I mean, you need to sign documents. And of course, the data sharing, consented data sharing here is the more important thing, which is, I mean, that is where you build trust, because trust will help us to ease the resistance at the adoption level. And of course, the payment platforms, and again, the discoveries. So those are basic building blocks that you need to have in any domain, any transformation domain. But unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, we don't have yet any of these DPIs. And so let's move into the execution. So designing, rolling out, and adoption. So there are multiple resistance at even, I mean, the rolling out, the multiple resistance. I mean, even you develop a system, there's hardly any use because people don't adopt it. So how do we, exploit this DPI approach to make this adoption happen, make it, executable and make this domino effect, achieve this domino effect in digital, the expected by digital transformation. So the DPI approach works on 3 trusses. The technology, because technology is important, but technology itself can't do this transformation. The technology is needed, the governance and the market. So these 3 trusses are quite significant when it comes to achieve this impact. So for example, if you take the land domain, so if you want to transform the land domain, so we need to identify what are the building blocks available. And of course, a country can develop those building blocks from scratch, or we can borrow from countries, those who have done it better or earlier. And when it comes to, as my colleague mentioned earlier, there are good DPIs, bad DPIs. I mean, there are principles, the minimalism, inclusivity, because we don't want to leave anyone behind. So whatever DPI we select must address the inclusivity. And it must be follow the minimalism approach. It must collect only a limited or only the required data fields, or the minimalism approach must be followed. That will help us to achieve higher adoption rate. And then the scalability, and then interoperability, and there are certain principles. So those principles are quite significant when it comes to select good DPI, because good DPIs will help us to achieve higher rate of productivity and to create better impact. So having said the understanding about DPI, let's see why DPI is so important to Sri Lanka at this stage. Because now, same here, same as India, India started digital transformation then way back in 1961. So here, Sri Lanka also started our digitalization journey 3 decades back. We spent billions on digital transformation, but if you see where we stand today, the best answer comes from United Nations eGov Development Index. According to this index, the country was at 83rd position in 2003, and it further fell down to 96 in 2022. So that shows the amount of work this country has to be done in digital transformation. And the good thing is the country has already done a strategy, Digital Economy Strategy 2030. The cabinet has already endorsed this strategy. Now we need to execute this strategy. So when it comes to execute this strategy, we must make sure this strategy is done in line with DPI approach. DPI principles must be well followed, and so proper governance is established. So at the moment, this strategy is under the purview of Ministry of Technology, but government is about to introduce a new piece of legislation called Technology Promotion Bill. So this bill is yet at the draft stage, and the bill will introduce 3 different organizations to drive this national digital economy strategy. So let's fingers crossed and see how government is going to set up this governance structure or the strategic governance model. So having said why it is so important at this stage, and let's see how we are going to adopt DPI in the country. So as I said, digital transformation is cultural. DPI is foundational, strategic, and so here the digital leaders will have to play a significant role. So as a practitioner in this country for the last 30 years, I have seen a huge vacuum in digital leadership. So from politicians to bureaucrats to technocrats, there's a huge leadership vacuum in digital arena. So we need to fill this DPI compatible digital vacuum in the country. So for which we need more and more similar conversation, brainstorming sessions, awareness practices are really required. So without filling this vacuum, DPI compatible digital leadership is a prerequisite to achieve digital economy strategy expected outcome. So I am quite optimistic that having the right digital DPI compatible digital leadership and market ecosystem, a market must be quite confident that DPI will really help them to achieve their market objectives. So these two segments, those two layers, the DPI compatible leadership as well as DPI compatible market layer or market ecosystem is really important to achieve or to achieve digital economy impact in Sri Lanka. So thank you.
Thank you. I now turn to Rahul Matan, partner at Tri-Legal, one of our country's leading experts on governance and regulation regarding digital public infrastructure.
Thanks, Pramit, and it's great to be here. Thank you, Rudy and Mahesh, for sort of setting the stage, as it were. I feel I have two-thirds of my talk taken away from me because Rudy spoke about just the need to think carefully around the market's approach to digital transformation. I think Mahesh mentioned the three trusses, which is technology, markets, and governance. I wanted to talk about all three, but that leaves me more time to talk about my pet subject, which is governance. And I think as we think about digital transformation of any government, one of the concerns that people have, that governments have, that the population has, is that as we digitize our governments, as we digitize our governance, what are the concerns that we have to keep in mind with this massive digitization of information about people, information about businesses, information about society? And there are risks around it. And if you think through the history of digitization around the world, there are basically two approaches. In the US, when we first started out with digitization, with the internet, with computers, it was left to the private sector. The private sector built out the infrastructure for the US. All of the US infrastructure and countries of that ilk are entirely in the control of the private sector. Now, when Rudy spoke about the tube wells, we are in that construct, very much going back to that sort of a framework where, of course, you've put out a tender, you've said, I want you to build this solution for us, but then the private sector decides exactly how that solution is built. And we all know the challenges with the US model of data governance. We've seen, what's happened with Cambridge Analytica. We've seen, all the other incidents that have been in the press. And so there has been a reaction to that sort of an approach, where countries, and that's been led by Europe, has written strong regulations. The strongest regulation, of course, is GDPR, which is the data protection regulation. And you can see how that sort of a regulatory framework plays into the sphere of what happens when corporations control so much of our personal data, have such deep insights into our personal lives and our private lives. And then, of course, Europe has got a whole digital strategy. They've got the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, they've got the AI Act, the Data Governance Act, the Data Act. So in Europe, the approach to data governance is really create this panoply of regulation. But we found that even the European approach doesn't really work, because regulation in the technology sphere always lags behind technology development, sometimes by as much as a year, which means that if there is a new evolution in artificial intelligence, as there was a couple of years ago with generative AI, it took a full year for EU to come up with a new AI regulatory approach with the AI Act, which has only just been published officially and is still not sort of coming into force for some time. So you see that even the regulatory approach, where essentially you don't leave the regulation in the hands of the private sector, but you force the private sector, in a sense, to comply with rules that the government puts out, takes some time. And in that time, harms happen. And so, as much as we think about DPI as a new way to do digital transformation, and I completely endorse the points made by both Rudra as well as Mahesh before, that this is the better way to do it, because it is reusable, it is shareable, costs are low, you're not dependent on vendors for each solution. Instead, you can have these interoperable solutions. All of this is good. And all of this is really, these are all really important reasons to adopt DPI as the way to do digital transformation. But I'm here to say that in addition to all of this, DPI is also a new way to do data governance. And that's because DPI, the entire DPI approach, allows us to embed within the infrastructure, within the technology infrastructure that the market players actually operate on, that the regulators actually regulate. We can embed into that infrastructure strong governance principles that embed privacy and data protection directly into the code, so that if you are participating on a digital public infrastructure, that you are actually, just by virtue of the fact that you are participating, complying with the principles that Mahesh mentioned about data minimization, which is a core principle of GDPR, has been a core principle of data protection since PIPs and various other, almost all data protection laws in the world have those principles, but also the principle of notice and consent, the principle of data retention. All of these principles can actually be embedded directly into the infrastructure, which allows countries to assure their population with some confidence that these principles are not going to be hijacked, that both the government as well as the private sector players that participate on this infrastructure will comply with those principles. It's also important to do things with the design of your digital public infrastructure that can enhance this. One of those examples is design your digital public infrastructure with federated data and federated storage in mind. What does this mean? When we think about digital public infrastructure, digital transformation, the first thing that comes to our mind is that all the data that is being generated by all these various digital systems are going to be aggregated into a central place. And if they're aggregated into a central place, it is of deep concern, because data which is concentrated in one location, there is a threat of breach and all of those concerns could exist. But also there is a risk that could become a honeypot, a source of surveillance and all of these sorts of concerning things. But DPI is designed such that it can be federated, so that data can be federated, which means you keep the data at the edge and you can build strong pipes to collect that data or process the data only when you need it, just in time. Now, these are the sorts of principles that, there's a whole string of these principles. The idea of using protocols and not platforms. The concern with platforms is we've seen all these big platforms. Amazon is the platform through which commerce happens. Uber is the platform through which ride-hailing happens. And you see that there are various monopolistic effects. There are benefits, network effects that unlock great value, but there are also monopolistic effects that governments can't control. And so if you can opt away from platforms and orient towards protocols, you can build a more competitive environment in which you can operate. As you build your DPI, think to build DPI that strongly encourage market participation. Don't allow just one participant to operate in your payments ecosystem. Ensure that the systems are interoperable such that multiple participants can participate in the ecosystem. When multiple participants are participating on an ecosystem that you govern and you control as the state and as the sovereign, you will see that market forces that these competitive players are subject to will actually improve the quality of services for the people of the country. Because as competitive market players on a platform that ensures equality and fairness, compete with each other to provide better services, the only people that benefit are really the consumers, the population of the country. So I can go on because I have literally written a book on all the data governance principles of digital public infrastructure. But it suffices to say that in addition to all the other benefits that have been spoken about today, if we are looking to address this challenge of data governance in the modern world, that really many countries around the world have tried and failed, this DPI approach offers regulators powerful new tools by which to implement data governance in a more relevant way, because the changes that you implement on the protocols that actually manage these digital systems will have immediate impact. If you change the way in which a particular DPI protocol is to work, it will come into effect tomorrow. We don't have to wait for a year for the law to get enacted. We don't have to wait for another year for it to be implemented. It will happen tomorrow, which allows us real strong tools by which to implement all our objectives of data governance and to implement it in a manner that is actually real to the people. So I would say that we, in addition to all the other things in relation to DPI, should also consider this. I wanted to also touch on the point that Mahesh made about capacity. There's no getting away from the fact that any digital transformation requires capacity. But it's a fact that not every country has that capacity. And so when we think about what is the appropriate amount of capacity that we need in order to do digital transformation, it will vary depending on the type of DPI deployment that you use. And Rudy mentioned this whole concept of DPI as a package service, the idea that we can actually deploy very quickly these sorts of digital solutions. I think that as we think about capacity, we should optimize for the type of DPI that we're using. The DAS model of DPI deployment actually requires much less capacity. It requires certainly that the regulatory framework needs to increase its understanding of how these DPI tools can be used. And I think that would really serve them well because, as I said, it is a tool for governance. So if you know how to use these DPI, you can actually do better governance. But you don't need to know to code. You don't need to know how to, really be a programmer, someone who builds large data centers, because the DAS model will take care of all of that. And so I think that as Sri Lanka thinks about DPI, there are now many options available. And as you skill up your people, there are many ways in which you can skill them up. And I think that is really the conversation that we should be having now. India started this journey 15 years ago. There is no need for any country to follow India exactly in its footsteps, because that is what was required 15 years ago. Today, we have many more options. We have much more learning. And India and CDPI and all of our organizations stand ready and willing to assist in trying to formulate these DPI solutions for the new world. I'll stop there. Happy to take questions in the Q&A.
Yes, and regarding questions, everybody, please, if you can, drop your questions in the chat or go to reactions and mark the raise your hand icon. Now I turn to Dr. Rohan Samarajiva of Learn Asia, which is a key digital policy institute in Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much. When I was thinking about this presentation, I thought about the topic that had been given, which was digitalization for enhanced connectivity, DPI for a connected future. Everybody's been talking about DPI, but I mean, conceptually, you could have DPI islands. So you could have a DPI set up in Sri Lanka, and then you could have another DPI set up in India. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a lot of intercommunication between them. Some of the work that we are doing at this point is looking at cross-border data flows in the context of a piece of legislation that is supposed to come into effect in April of next year, the Personal Data Protection Act of Sri Lanka. And we are also looking at the Indian Digital Personal Data Protection Act, which has both these acts have been made law, but I think their activation is a little in the future. So in this context, I'm going to talk about two things. One is a situation where data is already flowing between the two countries because of the integration of the Indian UPI and the Lanka QR system. This happened a few months back. So the question we asked, myself and a Indian colleague, we actually went around testing it out, trying to buy stuff from her phone, having some difficulties, and then me calling the guys at Lanka QR saying, what's going on? And we actually did a kind of a sort of elementary experiment. The issue there is that if now, first context. So an Indian tourist who comes here, or Indian citizen who comes here, who's got the app on their phone, they can use QR, scan the QR code that is available in shops, restaurants, etc. And they can make their payments for the last few months. So this is part of the Indian DPI stack. They can do this in Mauritius, they can do this in Bhutan, they can do this in a few other countries. Yeah. So Sri Lanka was a latecomer. It's asymmetrical in the sense that Indians can do it, but Sri Lankans still cannot do it in India. Now, there was a problem of standards because our guys, our QR system, done by a sort of bank-owned consortium company called Lanka Pay, had used the international standard, while the Indian payment standard was India's own. But they had done a middleware solution and they had got it to work. So this thing works. I mean, we had a little difficulties because of very early stages, but it works. Now, our interest was looking at the data flow restrictions that came from the laws. At least my interest is in looking at the Sri Lankan law, which mimics to a great extent GDPR, and its prohibitions on data flows. Also looked at the Indian law. Now, in this case, only the merchant ID and the merchant name goes up, which means that it's safe from the restrictive provisions of our law. You don't have to do adequacy decisions, classifications, express consent, all kinds of complicated stuff, right? So that's a good story. Now, I come back to what Rudra, my colleague Rudra Chaudhary said earlier about cloud-based solutions. Now, one of the things about physical infrastructure is that we can have sort of privileged access for defined countries or neighbors, those in the region, right? Digital generally doesn't do that. It's once you open it up, once you enable it, once you allow data flows, it can go anywhere. It can go to Singapore, it can go to India, it can do whatever. Now, the problem that we see now in the real-time digital payments issue, which is the Indian UPI or RuPay and the Sri Lankan Lanka QR, that's an agreement between the countries. So a Pakistani coming here won't get the benefit of that. That's just them. We also have similar arrangements with the Chinese, and we are planning to get one with the Nepalese and so on. So that's specific. Now, once we get to cloud-based solutions, I believe that we've dropped the ball on this. I think Sri Lanka dropped the ball on this because we have put extremely restrictive conditions on public authorities, that is government bodies, with regard to use of cloud services. So much so that we are looking at significant government activities having to be halted or made illegal by next April. And I have been in communication with the minister saying this is what's going to happen. You have very serious problems that we have to either do a workaround or even an amendment for the public sector. Now, with the non-public authorities, because Sri Lankan law differentiates between these two categories and has different treatments for them, non-public authorities, they have all kinds of pathways, but my argument is that all the pathways are complicated. So, for example, there is one where, now I'll illustrate that with an example. There are no modern, I think you understand that Sri Lanka considers the tourist industry to be very important, our hotels. We have two major Indian chains here. ITC has just landed and Taj has been here for a long time. Now, all modern hotels operate with something called a property management system. That shows who's checked in, whether the room is vacant, what kind of discounts have been given, the billing, the whole thing is integrated into the system. Affinity benefits, all these things are in the property management system. Now, if the property management system goes down, most probably the hotel will lose an enormous amount of money and goodwill in that short period. So, generally speaking, the hotel chains, the Marriotts, the Taj, etc. I haven't talked to the Taj, but I've talked to the others. They tend to have proprietary PMS where the data is sitting on the cloud outside Sri Lanka. Now, under our law, whether it's foreigners or local or whatever, their personal data will be inside the PMS, and they'll have to get explicit permission. That is not just consent, but some additional consent saying there are risks to your data flowing out of the country, and you acknowledge that, and here's another tick box and put a signature there, right? So that will apply to the Taj Group and ITC, because I also believe they most probably have an integrated PMS system. Now, this is no way to build connectivity and to do business in the modern age, right? And again, in terms of disaster recovery, etc., I have been going around recommending to people. I can remember I was maybe 10, 15 years ago, I was in Iraq and somebody came up with this data localization theory. I was inside the green zone of Baghdad. And I said, guys, the last place I would store data is in Iraq. If you want a reliable system, I would put my data storage outside Iraq, right? So I'm of the opinion that disaster recovery, business continuity, and all these things require us to do the 3-2-1 solutions, 3 copies, etc. And one that is far away as possible from where we are running the operation. And generally speaking, that would be the cloud, that would be somewhere other than the country that we are operating in. Now, unfortunately, I think I should stop at this point. The situation is that while we are talking about DPI and sharing architectures and all that, I completely agree with that. The issue is that we have to look at the legal impediments that could be coming from a sort of prior generation of thinking, which is before software as a service, before those kinds of things, before cloud became the default, as it's becoming increasingly. I'm also just about to write an article. We are using Zoom on this, and Zoom just sent me a privacy notice, and I checked to see whether I got one of my researchers to go through it in relation to the Sri Lankan Act. And Zoom, if I was in government, I wouldn't be able to use Zoom. It's as simple as that. Since I'm not in government, with some difficulties, right? So we're just shooting ourselves in the foot here. So we'll have to do something to look at the laws governing data localization, cross-border data flows. And we'll probably, there is one other route, which is trade agreement. The
Sri Lankan friends have said.
No, I think we're kind of largely in agreement, and it's nice to kind of meet with Rohan and Mahesh. And it's also, just 2 points I'll make is one, I think on the cloud, and maybe here Rahul has some inputs. I think at some level, we will have to look at national jurisdictions, regulations to keep up with the cloud more generally. In India at the moment, we're reconsidering a lot of protocols when it comes to cybersecurity, for instance. There are advantages to off-prem. There are sovereign advantages to on-prem. And I should just say over here is that the future of DPIs, my sense is one way or the other, will be on the cloud, especially for countries that simply just don't have the capacity to even think of creating the RFPs for procurement, leave alone the procurement process itself, right? So usually if you look at countries of a population of less than, say, 2-3 million, or even population of, like, say, Nauru, of 25,000 people, right? The usual way of doing this is you get a grant from a country or you get it from a transnational organization. You use a good portion of that grant to actually give it back to a consult firm who will then write an RFP for you, which will be designed around procurement, so on both ends, you're vendor locked almost, right? So I think the DPI way kind of opens kind of many of those kind of opportunities, but I think we'll have to look at templatized ways in which national regulation can also kind of support and be innovative enough to adapt with cloud-based solutions. So I don't know, Rahul, you deal with a whole range of countries now. You're also helping with various agreements, etc. If you have any nuggets, for instance, in terms of how do countries like Sri Lanka kind of go the DAS model?
Yeah, no, look, interesting point. And I think as we think through this DPI approach, I think the point that Rohan made is actually quite relevant in that we've got a legacy framework. It's not easy to transport ourselves from that framework into a new framework, but the benefits of this framework should suggest that we should revisit not only the old ways of doing digital transformation, but also the legislative, regulatory, and contractual frameworks in which we did the old ways of doing digital transformation. And having done some of these revised legal frameworks, it's not that hard. But I think it's important to recognize that it's different, because if we transpose some of the old frameworks, the liability frameworks, just the processes in procurement that we followed for decades, quite frankly, it's not going to work in this new approach. And so we really do need to think, in a sense, from first principles in order to do that. I saw a question in the chat around to have DPI laws integrated like FTAs. And I know that Ron made a few points around just the cross-border working of DPIs. I sympathize with all of those things. It's actually extraordinarily difficult to get DPIs to work cross-border. And I think that the Bank for International Settlements is trying a very interesting model with Nexus, where they're looking to create a sort of an ASEAN bridge for payment systems. We may have to do things like that. But to answer this specific question, to me, I think that DPI first needs to be built within countries, because I think there's extraordinary power that can be unlocked when you've got a full stack of DPI solutions working in the country. So quite frankly, in the work that I'm doing, I'm less interested in building the cross-border bridge at the first stage. I think the countries need to unlock the power of DPI within their ecosystem as the first step. And after we do that, if the DPI have been built using this idea, this DPI approach of shared reusable protocols, it actually will become easier to do some of the cross-border linkages. And I think the points made with regard to the payment system is very valid. I think there are different protocols that are floating around, and if we don't have some sort of uniformity of protocols, we're going to have to interconnect using middleware. But if you think about it, a lot of the value, all the examples that have been given on the call so far, land titling and records, these are all very national problems. If you think about direct benefits transfer, these are national problems. And so certainly we will unlock value in terms of tourism, in terms of other benefits when we unlock cross-border DPI operations. But the far greater value that we will unlock is nationally within the country. And so I think that at least since this whole thing is so new, our initial effort should be focused on trying to unlock the value of DPI within the country. And then hopefully do it in accordance with these protocols and principles. that will make it easier than it currently is to do DPI across borders.
I see Dr. Samarajiva wants to have a response. You're on mute.
The modularity that is afforded by the DPI will allow us to do various things with land and such things. The issue that I was getting at was because of the title, I was looking at connectivity and saying, what does connectivity mean, rather than sort of sharing of architectures. When it comes to trade, when it comes to people movements, and when it comes to payments in particular, data will have to cross the lines. And right now we can say, we've been doing trade for time immemorial. People have been moving money between countries. And I think on the payment area, particularly in our conversations with the central bank and the financial regulators, they have specialized rules. The India also has got specialized rules about where it can be kept, how long it can be kept, copies have to be retained, so on and so forth. So I think I prefer the Indian approach, where the Indian DPA allows for sectoral regulations to override the general regulation. I think that was a very wise move. And I've actually recommended to the Sri Lankan government that we try to adopt that. The only problem I see with the Indian law is that there is sort of an arbitrary power given to the minister at any point to come and shut things down for any sector, which is quite, I think, creates unnecessary risk and uncertainty. But yeah, I would agree. I think we can do intra-country stuff, but with regard to payments, tourism, things like that, the two examples that I used, there is that inter-country aspect that will have to be addressed. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Nirupama Subramaniam wants to ask a question. Please go ahead. And after that, if Mr. Pereira would like to make a final concluding comment, we'll end the session.
One question.
Hi, thanks, Pramit. I'd like to address this question to the Sri Lankan panelists. I've been reading since Professor Samarajiva was talking about the payments through UPI. I've been reading in the Sri Lankan media that it is not benefiting local traders or local shop owners or boutiques or whatever, because the payments made through UPI by Indians or by Indian tourists or whoever, by Indians, do not transmit locally, but they are somehow retained in Indian currency, and therefore these people need to open a bank account in India. Is that right?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I don't know what the source of that information is. As I said, an Indian colleague and I kind of went through trying to buy soft drinks and order coffee and so on. There is a problem with regard to the small vendors in Sri Lanka, because unlike in India, we don't have enough people signed up for Lanka QR. It seems like in India, pretty much all the vendors are in the system. I think part of the thinking behind this was that you would sort of create an incentive to get the business of the Indian tourists. You put the QR sign at your counter. But there is absolutely no issue about an Indian account or anything like that. That's some misconception. And I don't know how to, if I know who the journalist is, I'll try to educate them on that. Or I can get them to talk to the people who know this subject.
Oh, I just, before the Pathfinder Foundation, I see their hand is up.
Yes, I just want to add one more point. I think this session has been truly educative and informative. Though I'm not a subject specialist. What I found is different countries have different digitalization strategies. India has one, Sri Lanka has one. But when you look at the other regional grouping, like ASEAN and European Union, they have digital transformation strategies to harmonize rules and regulations. I think this is recognizing the fact today digital trade is expanding. According to UNCTAD study, about 25% of the world GDP. I think digital trade accounts for 25% of the GDP. In that context, we have this 6th BIMSTEC summit is coming. Is it not right, time is right for us to think of having a kind of a framework or a common strategy to harmonize these rules and regulations? And Professor Rohan Samaraji mentioned about these various standards different countries added. So I just direct this question to any panelist. Thank you.
Why don't I saw that Shubhamoy has also raised a question, and it's a very related one. Is it necessary to have cross DPI laws integrated into FTAs? Mr. Pereira, why don't you bring the session to a close with some responses perhaps to these issues? And anybody else who wants to make any comments, please put them in the chat.
Yeah, thank you very much giving the opportunity. Actually, I just need to answer the question for the last question. Now, digital economy strategy is the nation's strategy for national digital transformation. It talks all about empowerment, because you take citizen, you take the government, you take the businesses. They need desperately, these three segments in our society need empowerment. Now take citizen, if they need to get simple business registration, it takes 6 months. They need to visit multiple, multiple organizations for several times in order to get simple business registration. And even to amend this business registration, even you have it, you again need to take another 3 months to get this registration. And the government, again, government has same problem. The government is disconnected, the processes are not optimized, work in silos, the digital adoption is quite low. I mean, all these segments in our society need empowerment. So digitally empowerment is the key here. So that is what we are trying to do with this digital economy strategy. Now, I'm believing now India also did the same effort over the last 4 decades to having multiple strategies to achieve this, the impact. But we failed drastically until this DPI has given us the right way to do it. Now, DPI has all the DPI, as I said earlier, is foundational. I mean, you can't expect, magic from DPI, but we need to understand what's the purpose of DPI. DPI is foundational, and it's again, it's a building block, sort of a building block approach to build the transformational impact. And so that's why I mentioned, because now we need a DPI compatible leadership layer. Because though the DAS model works perfectly, the DPI as a sort of a package, it may work, but the transformation is all about culture. So unless you understand the cultural needs and the solutions we bring about with the support of the governance as well as the market forces, so the impact may not be able to, the impact we are trying to achieve may not realistic. So we have to be very careful with these cultures. The culture and cultural requirements must need to be well addressed. So the DPI has all the capabilities, because the DPI is the way to build trust. So trust will enable us to achieve, the higher impact and to ease the adoption resistance. So I am strongly believing the economic strategy has all the capabilities, but it needs to be well, executed having the right governance and the market ecosystems in place. So I'm quite optimistic that if you could build this leadership layer, DPI compatible leadership layer coming across politicians to bureaucrats to technocrat, I'm quite optimistic that country, Sri Lanka, will able to have the expected outcome in the digital economy strategy this time.
Thank you. Rudra, you have a 2-minute closing.
Yeah. Just to the person who brought up the question of BIMSTEC, and there are many others who say, look, why can't SEO do it, etc. The only thing I'll say is that, just build DPI in your own country that is shareable, interoperable, reusable. No matter what it's called or how you do it, for instance. Stick to these basic principles. The diplomatic effects, the economic effects cross-border will come over time. Don't stop top-down. There is no point in a BIMSTEC argument or an architecture around this if countries that are part of BIMSTEC have not actually gone the DPI way. So focus on your own country. And as Rahul said, the potential that it can unlock, the rest will come over time. Let's not fast forward, because you won't. If you fast forward, you will just rewind back to 50 years where we'll end up building tube wells.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And I hand it over to the next session. Swati, will you be transitioning us there?
Hello. Good morning to everybody, distinguished speakers and participants. I think the second session of this roundtable discussion is focused on another important dimension of the connectivity, that is physical and maritime connectivity between the two countries. Today, by far, two countries maintain an excellent bilateral relationship in many fronts. The subject of physical connectivity has come to the forefront of the public debate among politicians, policymakers, and civil society. There are, of course, divergent views, historical perspective, economic perspective, and certain environmental perspective. One important view that I would like to emphasize is that transforming Sri Lanka, I'm just talking about the Sri Lankan perspective, into a logistic and energy hub for the region should be one of the development priority in which well-managed physical maritime connectivity play a vital role. The idea of physical connectivity between the two countries are not new. There have been many initiatives, studies, and there are a number of ongoing projects. To delve on the subject, we have 4 veteran presenters, 2 speakers, and 2 discussants. I think given the limited time, we have initially allocated 40 minutes. What I would propose is each speaker, 2 speakers, first from Sri Lankan side, take about 10 to 12 minutes, and then the discussion could take about 7 to 8 minutes. With that, let me introduce the first speaker, former Permanent Secretary, Engineer Ranjit Pemasiri, Ministry of Transport and Highways. By profession, he is a chartered civil engineer with extensive experience in civil engineering, construction and management. Most importantly, he is also the convener of the Pathfinder Foundation study group on envisioning India-Sri Lanka physical connectivity. Engineer Pemasiri, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bharatna. And good morning to everybody joining for this Zoom meeting. And today actually I'm talking about the physical, the session is for bridging borders, enhancing connectivity between Sri Lanka and India. And we can talk about the discussion between the President of Sri Lanka and the Prime Minister of India in July 2023 regarding the partnership between two countries in different sectors. And both leaders actually acknowledge the better partnership would enable both countries to progress, and especially to Sri Lanka, because in the difficult time, India helped us a lot in providing funding and also providing all the supports. And then they discuss about the connectivity between the two countries in different sectors. And they actually discuss in maritime connectivity and air connectivity, power and energy, and then trade and economic, and the people-to-people connectivity. That main focus was the land connectivity between the two countries. If we talk about this maritime connectivity, I think Mr. Romesh David will talk about it later because he's an expert of port development. I just go through it because we have three important ports. The Colombo port, it's a hub in Southeast Asia, and the 22nd the largest port in the world. And also we have at Hambantota port, the newly built one that's developing, and also then this Trincomalee port, that's the natural harbor existing in the world. And also the Kankasanture port, the government is planning to build this Kankasanture port with Pandit from India. And for Colombo development will talk about by Mr. David. And when you talk about air connectivity, we have two international airports, one in Katunayaka and one in Mattala. And at the moment, we are having air connectivity between India, especially with southern Indian cities, from Colombo to southern Indian cities and North Indian cities, and also from Jaffna to southern Indian cities. Now, weekly, we have about 97 flights between the two countries, and transporting about 15,000 passengers here and there. And from Jaffna to Chennai, we have 7 flights weekly. And this air connectivity, I think we have potential to expand further because now we are going to have a management changes in the Mattala airport with private sector coming there. And we can use Mattala airport for air connectivity between two countries, because the southern area is also tourism attraction area. Now, when you talk about tourism, the Indian tourists are the most the prominent tourists to Sri Lanka at the moment. And also we can think about further developing air connectivity in future. When you talk about energy and power connectivity, Sri Lanka is having issues with power generation and also the energy sourcing. Our power generation mainly based on hydropower, the thermal power, and also this coal power. And the plan is to enhance our power generation towards renewable energy with wind power and solar power is to come to enhance our power generation system. And in this case, actually, we have a potential to generate more power with our geographical location and also the sources we have in the country. And for this one, the government is encouraging developing renewable energy sources with recently with Indian investments. And the plan at the moment, the Power and Energy Ministry have some plans to develop wind power at Pudarin and also in Mana, and also solar in Trincomalee. But with this power generation, we can exchange this power with India and other regional countries, and also we can exchange power from India to our country also. For this one, actually, there is a plan to have a high capacity power grid connection between two countries. One sea that will be between that will be a reliable energy source through a undersea high power cable, plus two augmentation of overhead power lines from Madurai to India, and then from Vaunia to Habarana also. These are actually these power lines will connect power supply to both countries. And these power projects will implement very soon with the investment from Indian investors. and these benefits of this power connectivity would be we have the power and energy security for the country, even in difficult times, because we have been undergoing 8 to 10 year power cuts during past about 2 years ago. But with this reliable power connectivity between two countries, and also the development of power generation, we can overcome these difficulties, and that will help the economic growth of our country, and that brings sustainable energy and better cooperation with the two nations. Mr. Benji, 2 minutes, please. Okay, quickly. Okay, then we have one in the energy sector. There is a plan to connect Sri Lanka with the energy multi-product pipeline to Sri Lanka, one to Muthurajawala and one to Trincomalee Port, to provide gasoline and gas, and also that will benefit the laying of fiber cable. And this my main focus is actually the land connectivity between the two countries. India and Sri Lanka had a long relationship from ancient times, and we heard that there was a connectivity between two countries during ancient times. We call Rama during Rama Sita story. Now, this objective of this land connectivity would be, one is the economic integration with India, because India is fast developing with 6 to 7% growth rate, but we are very behind of this growth rate, and with the connecting these two countries with the physical connectivity, we can call it's a bridge between two countries from Dhanushkodi to Kalevanna, and pre-feasibility studies have been done by the external Ministry of India, and that they have identified 6 alignment of sea bridge, and out of that, that is actually this two alignments have been identified as most suitable, and out of that,
yeah. We can do that. We can have during the question and answer.
Okay.
I didn't because sorry. So, well, thank you very much, Mr. Pemasiri. Really very excellent presentation, but no time to go through all details. So let me introduce the next speaker, Mr. Ramesh David, CEO of the South Asia Gateway Terminal, Port of Colombo, and which is the first public-private partnership project in the port sector. I think to his name, there are many affiliations to his profession. I am not going to go into all these details. Ramesh, could you just limit your presentation to 10? I know you have a few slides within 10 minutes. That would be greatly appreciated. Ramesh, over to you.
Thank you, Daya. If I may share my screen with some trepidation. Okay. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thank you to the Ananta Center and Ananta Aspen Centre and Pathfinder for having me on. Let me very quickly, I think, to set the stage, have a quick glance at what maritime connectivity looks like, or maritime density of traffic. And if we see on the screen globally, the deepest red spots are connections or hubs or naturally occurring centers of maritime concentration. And if we zoom into the Asian region as a whole, we see that South Asia is one of those centers, similar to Singapore, where you see the Straits of Malacca, similar to the choke point that we see today in the Red Sea. And we are very much so as South Asia, Colombo and South Asia in general, the southern tip of India. We are sitting smack bang on virtually astride the main sea route, and so are geographically a naturally occurring maritime point of confluence. Now, this has been used by Colombo, Sri Lanka quite effectively since the early 1980s. To grow and build its container transshipment. But unfortunately, that growth has been limited to the port itself and has not really morphed into anything bigger than that or greater than that, as some of the other hubs around us have done, like Dubai and Singapore. So I think the point here is a lot of this growth has also been inhibited to a great extent to phobias on both sides of the pork Strait. I think traditionally, and these go to the mindsets that Bernard referred to in his opening remarks, where there are a lot of inhibitions bordering on being phobic, both on the Indian side and on the Sri Lankan side. Sri Lanka is plagued by the island mentality and the fearfulness of the big neighbor. Whilst India have always been, Sri Lanka as a market has never been big enough, but this whole perceived reliance on Sri Lanka or Colombo as a transshipment hub has created this massive angst amongst, not only in the public sector, not only politically, but even amongst think tanks, amongst the policymakers, that this whole reliance on India's trade for the transshipment ports is a drawback and is a strategic weakness that needs fixing. Hence, this this dire urgency to create transshipment ports that are Indian. I think a lot of this stems from the misconception of this reliance. A transshipment port is essentially a factor of capacity, and transit and the port. And my submission has always been, and we do a lot of work in India and in Bangladesh particularly, because we are reliant. Sri Lanka is reliant on 60% of its cargo to come to and go from India. And this is really a function of capacity.
And as far as looking at it from a pure transportation perspective, having an efficient outlet, Colombo is simply another outlet for India's trade. It really adds to its trade competitiveness rather than being a vulnerability in terms of not having its own deep water ports. So just going back here, a lot of this concentration is reliant on on the fundamentals of what is today's liner shipping, which is the hub and spoke concept. Very large ships plying on main sea routes, which are fed by hubs and which are fed by spokes, smaller ships operating on the spokes. Now, the capacity of these hubs have to be projected, and there is no reason why there can't be hubs in India, that is on the southern tip of India, places like Vizhinjam, places like Kerala, Cochin. They are bigger diversions from the main sea route and may not attract the largest of the ships, but there is absolutely no reason, because the growth of trade in the region and the growth of transshipment is purely a function of capacity. And regionally, if we increase capacity, then it automatically draws additional traffic and volumes to the region. And this is amply evidenced by multiple examples in the region. If you look at Singapore and Malaysia, the advent of Tanjung Pelepas, the advent of Westport, the addition of huge volumes of capacity simply augmented volumes passing through. The same thing has happened in Dubai and is now happening with Abu Dhabi. Dubai and Abu Dhabi, two huge ports sitting right next to each other, will fill up very quickly. The same thing happens in Rotterdam. The more terminal capacity you add, the more volumes that come. So I think the misconception on both sides of India and Sri Lanka, in Sri Lanka, that the growth of Indian ports is a massive threat, and in India, that the failure to grow transshipment ports is a strategic disadvantage, are both misplaced, because in global examples, and I think this is easily evidenced by the examples that we have, capacity creates the demand, because networks are a function of capacity, and global shipping lines build their networks around capacity. And of course, performance is a given. Capacity itself has to be created well ahead and projected well ahead in order to create that demand. And I think the great thing, Mr. Premasiri covered the road connectivity. What that road connectivity, if it is expanded to both road and rail, will create a virtual single zone for transportation, very similar to what the Channel Tunnel has done, very similar to what multiple other examples have done. And ferry connectivity will add the passengers to that as well. And the same thing applies to the fuel. I will touch briefly on the pipeline connectivity. Again, bunkers, maritime fuel, fossil fuels are going to remain. While I will talk quickly about a roadmap to change that, fossil fuels are going to remain a huge part of maritime fuel, ships fuel, for the next 30 years. And that again is almost entirely a function of location and capacity. So we have Sri Lanka is a prime example that every time additional capacity came on stream, volumes of product traded went through the roof. We saw that with the expansion, minimal expansions in Colombo, the minute capacity was added in Hambantota, minute capacity, the Trinco Trank farms are brought on stream, volumes traded went through the roof. And a lot of this, linking with the expanded capacity, with the availability of product from India, particularly the South Indian refineries, would give a huge boost to bunkering in the region, both from an Indian export perspective and a re-export perspective from Sri Lanka. Getting on to the next stage of bunkering is going to be green fuel. The IMO, the International Maritime Organization, has a very clear roadmap for net zero in 2050. The 2020 sulfur cap has already been and has come into effect. 2030 is aiming for 40%, 2040 for 70%, and obviously zero. And Sri Lanka, I think people know, has a massive untapped potential for both onshore and offshore energy. Wind and solar. It is expected, I think roughly the anticipation is that it's about 10 times Sri Lanka's national requirements. This gives rise to a huge potential for green energy, green hydrogen, green ammonia, green methanol, which are really the future fuels for ships. And this creates an opportunity to make Sri Lanka and the region, the whole South Asian region, a green bunkering hub. So the greatest advantage of grid connectivity is the conversion of this renewable power into green hydrogen, but the connectivity underwrites the production of that green hydrogen through having a constant flow of power. I'm almost done, and the last one of this obviously is using these green power to sorry, that was my timer.
Ramesh, anything to add or finish?
Yeah, so I think I can, on the grid connectivity, again, it underwrites Sri Lanka's initiatives again to turn green ports. Green ships are one part of greening the whole greenhouse gas emission, and ports and terminals are the other part. And we have this, and a big initiative there is also electrification of all the port equipment, in addition to digitization and automation. A big part of electrification is that we have sufficiency and constancy of power, which we are unable to do now today. And grid connectivity with India would then certainly underwrite that to a great extent. So that's, I'm happy to take any questions thereafter, but that's.
Thank you, Ramesh, for your brevity. Let me now turn to discussion. First, Mr. Hari Krishnan Sundara, CEO of the Colombo West International Terminal. Could you present your views within a period of 7 minutes, please?
For sure, Mr. Daya. Am I audible?
Yes.
I think one of the most important points which Mr. Romesh has already covered in his presentation, the role of Port of Colombo that will be played in this whole India-Sri Lanka connectivity, maritime connectivity. If you look at the history, the transshipment opportunities in the region is directly linked to what capacity is available. I think this was very, very evidently clear from Romesh's presentation and also what he spoke. And something that the Port of Colombo has not seen over the past 10 years. The last terminal that came into operations was the CICT terminal, which is operated by the China merchants. After that, if you see, nothing has been no capacity has been added in the Port of Colombo. As we speak, there are two terminals that are upcoming. One is the West Container Terminal 1, which we are developing as a consortium of Adani Ports, John Keels and SLPA, and the East Container Terminal, which is being developed by the SLPA. These are the two upcoming terminals, possibly in the next 6 months to 1 year time frame, which will add about a couple of million TEUs of capacity in their respective phases of development. But so that's going to be very, very critical. So Port of Colombo is, of course, we all know that the location is very attractive. It's a very strategically positioned, port, lies in the main shipping route. All that being said, important is to have the capacities on time, be available for the shipping lines to, grab that capacity, especially when the competing terminals in Singapore, Malaysia, and in the Middle East are constantly, ramping up their capacity. Because transshipment is a pure, cost game. I mean, the most competitive, transshipment port gets the maximum business. Of course, it also depends on the location of the port, right? But Colombo, I think, couple of important points to note is India is growing at about 8-9% annually, right? And India's domestic volume itself is about 20-22 million TEUs. And out of that, east coast of India, when you look at starting from Calcutta right up to Tuticorin, Colombo is the natural gateway port for the east coast of India terminals. And there are no deep draft terminals available on the east coast of India. If you go up to Calcutta, Haldia, Vizag, Chennai, Tuticorin, these are all terminals with just about 14-15 meter draft, right? And therefore, Colombo will always be an attractive proposition for the shipping lines to cater to the east coast of India volumes, number one. West coast of India has deep draft terminals, which is the port of Mundra, the port of Pipavav, and the port of Nhava Sheva. So those will always have direct mainline calls going to Europe, US, Mediterranean, and all the other sectors. But east coast of India will not have those direct calls. That's where Colombo will step in to provide that connectivity. And very important point is that India-Sri Lanka connectivity, where Port of Colombo will play a role. The other important location for us is Bangladesh. Today, Bangladesh is only about 20% of the volumes that comes to Colombo, 20 or 25%. The balance is going to Port Malaysia and Singapore. The reason we don't have capacity over here. So once we develop the capacity here, opportunity to get a larger share of volumes is definitely there. Therefore, that's what I think we are doing now. As West Container Terminal, we are on stream to come with a capacity of about 1.5 million TEUs by early next year, by early 2025. And then the future development plans of Port of Colombo also need to be kind of fructified. There has to be a West Container Terminal 2, then there has to be ECT fully developed. And there is the North Port Development Plan, which is a slightly long-term plan. So I think I'm getting a prompt from Mr. Chaudhary for Paradeep. Mr. Chaudhary, Paradeep, if you see, it's largely a bulk port, right? There is hardly any container volumes there. JM Bakshi, I think, operates a small container terminal, but that's about 2,000 containers per month. So it's a very small volume to even talk about. Of course, again, that volume also has to come to Colombo through a feeder ship to connect to a mothership. So that's my limited submission on this India-Sri Lanka maritime connectivity, where Port of Colombo will play a very, very important role, subject to infrastructure available and capacity available on time.
Much. Very brief. You save a lot of time for question and answer session. Next speaker, Mrs. Nirupama Subramanian. Nirupama writes on Indian foreign policy and national security issues. She was the national editor of the Indian Express, writing on security and foreign policy. I think you can present the different perspective. Again, within 6 to 7 minutes, could you complete your presentation? Over to you, Nirupama.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pathfinders and Ananta, for organizing this. Connectivity should be really a no-brainer subject between any two countries, but it remains a contentious issue, not just between India and Sri Lanka, but across South Asia. And I'm a journalist, and I'm bringing my understanding as a journalist to this. I'm no expert in connectivity, but I've spent enough time in Sri Lanka to have some understanding of what goes on. And I'll begin by saying that if the true purpose of connectivity is to bring people together, if that is it, then let us start by identifying who these people are. what their needs are, and what is the idea of connectivity, instead of starting with you know, what form this connectivity should take, and kind of really concretizing it as a great solution. And so, you know, you probably guessed what I'm going to say. I'll focus on the land bridge, and we are going to. It's going to cost about $5 billion by current estimates, but I honestly think that this is not what the two countries should be focusing on, and that's my top line. But what I want to deal with first is, you know, there was a ferry service that we have been, as Ambassador Bernard pointed out, we tried to start for years. And then there was an MOU in 2011, and then it began last year. Whatever's happened to this? It was to be first started between Kankesanturai in Jaffna, and it was to go up to Karikal, and then they said no, it'll go up to Nagapattinam. It ran for, I don't know, for a week or two. Then it was put off apparently due to bad weather, and then it never took off again. So my point is, you know, this was the service that was going to help both Tamil traders in northern Sri Lanka, and it was going to help in the overall development of the north and the east, which were both very badly hurt. Their economies were completely shattered by the war, and it was something to sort of get over that, to repair that. And it is, I mean, it's a mystery to me, and I think journalists are to blame that when something is started, we announce it with great fanfare, but nobody knows why it has not been restarted after that grand opening. And one thing could be the fares. Were they too high? It was about $90. Was it about, you know, was it about the GST that we charge on our side? India has offered to pick up that GST for a year. It has also offered to give $60 million, which is the entire cost of the project. And I really regret that this is not taken off in a way, because, you know, in all my years that I have been familiar with Sri Lanka, I have seen, you know, at that time, we could only talk about air connectivity, and even now it's the primary connectivity. There was traders from Chennai and traders from Colombo, you know, carrying dried fish from there, carrying jasmine flowers from here. I've seen a person actually rush to the gates when it, you know, he was a little late, and said, you know, I'll go even standing. I have all these flowers. Let me just go as a standing passenger in the flight. I mean, it's that there was that much eagerness for this kind of trade, and there was quite a bit of it. And the fact that, you know, and now this ferry was going to allow people to carry 60 kilos as their personal baggage, and this would have helped traders enormously. Also, there was a thought that because there are so many temples in northern Sri Lanka, you know, Tirukoneshwaram in Trinco, and Kirimalai in Jaffna, and Tirukethuiswaran in Mannar, these would become also the Madhu Church in Mannar. These would become points of pilgrimage, and, you know, you could go there. But I really don't know why this is not taken off yet. Perhaps it was also the connectivity issues, that there was, you know, that Nagapattinam is, you know, it's 85 kilometers to Tanjavur, you know, and it's not the best of connections from there. Also, you know, so the other thing is that yeah, the other thing is also, could it be that the airports don't want to lose their traffic? Is that also the reason that this has been slow to take off? I would put this question to the Sri Lankan participants in this panel. So when a simple project like a ferry service gets repeatedly stalled over apparently, I don't know, small reasons, it makes you think about what is really bothering this. And is that a good way to, in fact, get into a land bridge idea? You know, all ambitious infrastructure projects sound great because they are a challenge. I mean, they challenge our mastery over technology, design, architecture, all that. But this shouldn't become a vanity project. The question to ask about the land bridge really is, what is the buy-in from people on either side? And at the purely local level, let us not forget that there is a huge problem between fishers of both countries in Tamil Nadu and in that entire northwestern Jaffna, even up to Trincomalee. There's a problem between Indian fishermen and Sri Lankan fishermen. And I'm sure the project report has gone into this, but my sense is that local fishing communities cannot be bypassed by any land connectivity project. And short of relocating entire populations, there's no way around this. There is also the environmental impact of digging up shoals of sand in that narrow strip of water. And this is one of the reasons, and I'm sure people are here from the ports and all, and this is one of the reasons that the Setu Samudram project was quietly given up. I mean, they were digging up so much sand, and they were going into somewhere near the Andaman Islands to actually jettison it. And that was seen as risky for many reasons, environmental reasons and so on.
Thank you, Nirupama. I think you made your excellent point by the land.
So I just want to make one more point. Which is that, if you think of why BBIN, the motor vehicle agreement of BBIN didn't work, it was because Bhutan took an opt out of that because it fears an invasion by Indians. And it says we don't have the infrastructure. So,
thank you.
Yeah, so that is mine.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there are a couple of questions already. Hands are raised. First, before I go to the two questions from Rohan and Ramesh, let me give the floor to Ambassador Gunatilaka. He has 1 point to respond.
Thank you very much. This basically relates to the several questions raised by Nirupama just now. Why are we focusing on mega projects like the road and rail connection, where we have failed in reconnecting the ferry service? A very valid point. In fact, as I had to briefly mention, our ferry connection started in 1914, almost a century ago. Before that, there was a steamer connection between India and Sri Lanka that started maybe turn of the century, 20th century. That service was discontinued in the 1940s, and the ferry connection between Rameshwaram and Kalimana stopped in 1980s. There may be several reasons why we have failed to start it. As you recall, the railway connection that was destroyed during the fighting was restored with the Indian aid by 2015, and Prime Minister Modi actually started the connection. But unfortunately, although the rail connection up to Talimana was inaugurated by Prime Minister Modi, the ferry connection was not possible because the infrastructure on both sides, both Talimana as well as in Rameshwaram, is not there, and it will take considerable time and expenditure to get this thing working. So the Indian side has taken some steps to call for expression of interest to restart the ferry service, but unfortunately we have not done anything with regard to the infrastructure development. Then, of course, speaking about the Nagapattinam KK's ferry service, again, there is a problem with regard to the selection of a suitable vessel. Service started in October last year, and immediately after that it stops due to the monsoon. They are yet to restart. So there are commercial reasons, there are infrastructure development issues, just to restart what we had 100 years ago. So a question raised by Nirupama is very important. When we can't go back to what we had in 100 years ago, how are we going to go through this $5 billion project? Well, we will have to find solutions to that issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gundilega. Now, before I give the floor to Ramesh, let me invite Rohan first and then followed by Pramit for your question, please. Rohan, please.
Yeah. Thank you. My question is that we can't go back to where we were 100 years ago. That is, should not be an objective. It should not be what we are trying to do. Each of these things, I think Nirupama is absolutely right. We have to ask, what are we trying to achieve with this? The logic of a road or rail bridge has to move goods and to connect to value chains, connect value chains, rather than to have small traders who are exploiting arbitrage opportunities in our customs rules. So if people are hauling large amounts of stuff between countries, efficient ways as passenger baggage, that suggests that there's something wrong with the way we charge tariffs and so on and so forth. So if there is a logic for moving moving goods via ferries or ship, as against the more efficient and more timely air links, where if you take a flight, you actually end up in a population center. You take these ships, you end up in the middle of nowhere, and my calculation from whatever the last time I looked is that it takes about 9 hours to get from Pamban to Chennai. And that's an additional cost that has to be factored in. And we also have the problem that, as Ambassador Gunatilaga said, the infrastructure on our side is not fully developed. I don't know why, but the rail line is a single track rail line, which has got limited capacity. So I think all these things are important questions that need to be asked. But I think our objective should not be to go back to the pre-jet era when air traffic was not a viable competitor to these kinds of services. Thank you.
You raise the hand. Please be brief. Over to you. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I have a just quick question. One of the things that hasn't been discussed in these presentations is finance. Because while Sri Lanka has done a remarkable job in recently working out an external debt deal, what it has done, partly because China's refusal to go down accept a haircut, is you've extended your debt, your external debt, but the debt, should we say, future is still extraordinarily onerous. You will retain an external debt equivalent to about 100% of GDP all the way to 2030 at least, if not to 2032. And on top of that, this is macro linked. In other words, it depends on Sri Lanka accomplishing a certain degree of economic growth during that period. And if you looked at the details on how the bonds function, there's a huge downside if Sri Lanka fails to maintain that growth. So the question for me is that while I can see, for example, India being prepared to put up money, for example, on the power power grid, because that has a certain strategic element to it as well. Some of the other elements, Sri Lanka may have to raise the money itself, or it will end up somehow on Sri Lanka's books, even if the capital comes from somewhere else. This is going to be a remarkably high risk decision given the state of Sri Lanka's external debt situation, and even to some degree its domestic debt situation, which is not fully resolved, over at least the next 5 to 10 years. So I'm curious to see what kind of financial models or innovations you have in mind.
The question you have raised is a different focus, but I will leave panelists to respond. Before I give it to the panelists, I just want to read out 2 questions posted in the Zoom meeting. One is the panel stress on push connectivity and moving away from the island mentality. Any suggestion where to begin this process with? Wouldn't domestic politics and nationalism limit any such magnitude? That is one. Second is another one, sympathy. Would you like to quickly make your point, please?
Very good morning. Am I audible?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yes, I am Sripati. I am from Delhi, originally from Chennai. So, my questions are 2 points. Is that when you're talking about land connectivity, I was born in 86, and before I was born, first day, first show of MGR movies, fishermen from Java used to come to Rameswaram to watch MGR movies. It was not that cross-park day relationship was 19 new. And I don't know how many people here knows the socio-cultural implication of FDFS, first day, first show. Second question is that, sir, my point is that when you are talking about connectivity and everything, why is it that IOC Lanka and the Trincomalee oil farms are almost near consistently facing one form of protest after another? When you actually dispassionately look at it, India's energy sovereignty is being outsourced to Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is the guarantor of South India's energy sovereignty if all those oil farms are filled.
Okay, thank you. I think couple of question. First, Ramesh, would you like to take the floor and respond?
Thank you, Daha. The question on Vizhinjam, I think I tried to make the point on capacity. The addition of capacity at Vizhinjam will only serve to increase cargo flows into the region. And true, there may be some short-term flows. And if you look at what is happening right now, Colombo, like all other transshipment hubs, is very congested, and performance has come down because there are delays. And the fact that Vizhinjam is ready and available has actually kept those transshipment flows within the South Asia region. If not for that, then they would have had to be moved, rerouted somewhere else, either into the Gulf or to Southeast Asia, Singapore, Tanjung Pelepas, or Westport. So capacity is really the driver of growth, and I think that capacity, whether it gets added at the southern tip of India or in the port of Colombo, will only augment the growth in the region. I have a very small point to make on the connectivity on the ferry. I think I'm probably one of the few people on the panel who's actually been on the ferry. And my father in 1980 bought a ticket in Colombo Fort. He bought a train ticket for me to go to Chennai. Now, one of the biggest drawbacks or one of the reasons why the connectivity has failed is that I think, like digital public infrastructure, like the DPI, maybe this is an element that really needs to get done by the state actors. The interoperability between ferries and railway was core to the operation of Rameswaram, the Talavana Rameswaram ferry. And you could buy a ticket from any train station in Colombo to any train station in India and vice versa. And today, it's still the same actors. It's Indian Railways on the other side and CGR on this side. And so to have a ferry in isolation is really a long ask. As to Rohan's point about, going back to the pre-jet age, I think the existence of a ferry and the interoperability with the rail will give rise to a whole raft of new, not only trade, but in tourism, in lower cost domestic travel, that will be very difficult to replicate with air connectivity, and that serves a whole different market. So those were the 2 points I had to make. Thank you.
Do you want to add anything? Yes, Mr. Pamis,
regarding the question of financing this land connectivity, at the moment, actually, only the pre-feasibility study has been done, and they have identified 2 methodology. One is the public-private partnership, and then design, build, finance, operate, and transfer model, or EPC model with some financing from the governments and some donor agencies. But still we cannot say what would be the better way until we do a proper detailed project report done. Then we can decide whether what would be the financial model, or what could be the financial model that will suit the construction.
Thank you. I think we had a very good discussion. Just to respond to what Pramis mentioned about the debt structuring, how we are going to finance it. Well, we don't know the specificities of the overseas debt restructuring, but there are 3 dimensions. One is the haircut, one is the concession on the interest rate payment, and the third one is the longer payment period. On all these 3 fronts, one economic reality is Sri Lanka has to finance itself either through integration, economic integration, expanding our trade, attracting more tourists, and attracting more FDI. In terms of economic growth, currently this year we forecast 3% of growth. I think what is expected is more than 6% average economic growth. This can only be achieved, all these export textile enhancement, tourists, this all depends on how we push our reform agenda, and the trade and logistic connectivity play an important, vital part on all these things. I think with that, we had a very rich debate. Let me now go on to the next session for the concluding remarks. Thank you. Thank you, all the speakers and those who asked very good question, making the debate is very lively one. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Mr. Tarun Das would like to, share the closing remarks from Ananta's side, please. Mr. Das, over to you.
Thank you very much. I have a love affair with Sri Lanka, and for those of you who don't know, a friend of mine, Ken Balendra, pulled me into Sri Lanka many years ago, and I served with great pleasure and great honor on the John Keel's board for many years, and it's good to see Ramesh, David here. We have sat around the same boardroom many times. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm so glad that you all chose the subject of connectivity because it is critical, and the speakers and the questions have shown how important it is to our bilateral relationship, and we need to keep working at it. I want to thank Ambassador Melinda Moragoda, founder of Pathfinder Foundation, for his encouragement and his support and leadership in making this happen, this meeting happen, this strategic dialogue. And also to thank Ambassador Bernard Gunathilaka, Chairman of Pathfinder Foundation, for being here with us and for conducting this particular strategic dialogue. I hope that we will meet again. I heard you say that you have several connections in India, and that's fine. But I hope that Ananta Aspen Centre and Pathfinder Foundation will have agendas to discuss with each other usefully. My last point is just to say that I've always felt this, that we need to build trust between us more and more. And trust doesn't get built by words. It only gets built by actions. And perhaps the major responsibility for that is more on India and perhaps less on Sri Lanka. So I put the onus on India to continue to work to earn the trust of Sri Lanka and Sri Lankans, so that all the advantages that we see in our mutual collaboration will lead to more and more mutual benefit. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. And thank you to all the speakers and the chairs of the sessions, and particularly to Mr. Moragoda, Ambassador Moragoda, and to Ambassador Gunathilaka for their encouragement and leadership. Thank you.
Das, for your kind words. On behalf of the Pathfinder Foundation, on my behalf, let me take this opportunity to extend our heartfelt gratitude to all the esteemed speakers, participants, moderators for their valuable contribution. As Ambassador Gunathilaka mentioned in his opening remarks, this is the first engagement with the Ananta Center, Aspen Center. So I hearing from you, I think this is the first of a series of engagement, because we have a lot of synergies on the subject area we handle, and we look forward to working with you. And thank you for the Ananta Center team for your collaboration in making this event success. I think today's two sessions mainly focus on the connectivity. Connectivity is a multidimensional concept, but we touch upon was the digital connectivity and physical connectivity. There are other areas where we can focus on in future engagement, like trade connectivity, so on, as we set out in our framework initially exchanged between us. There are a number of key takeaways. I didn't know time to go into detail, but just to say that discussion underscored on the digital DPI connectivity immense potential of digital public infrastructure in bridging the gap and creating a more connected future. We need to learn from each other, from the best practices, and also making collaborative efforts. On the physical connectivity side, there are a lot of the areas where we can discuss further. I think Nirupama made a very good salient point. So we must make lower hanging fruit without much effort, with the delayed effort to put it into more implementation, ferry service, so on. So with this, let me conclude again. Thank you for Ananta Center and the whole team, and also Pathfinder team working hard to make this event success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, for
Thank you
joining
for
us.
joining.